All right. Very welcome, everyone. Welcome here in the Blauwe Zaal. Welcome to this program by Studium Generale of the Eindhoven University of Technology. It's very nice to see such a big crowd here in the audience. That was a long time ago. So good to have you here. Well, as you can see in this picture, we are going to discuss the connection between belly and brain. The connection between, or maybe better to say, the interaction between the microbiota, the intestines, and our brain, and also how these interactions affect cognition and well-being. And I have a question already for you. Who of you is feeling a bit hungry right now? It's, of course, lunchtime. Yeah, I see some hands. Yeah, okay. Then my follow-up question is it affecting your mood also? Yes, and can you explain it a little bit more?
I think a little bit more irritating.
More irritating. You are now a bit more irritated. So okay, then I stand back. But that's nice to hear. Someone else who would like to reflect on that question? And yeah.
I also can't focus.
You can't focus. Oh, then you have a hard job to do now during this lecture. Okay. Could someone give some other example of interaction between belly and brain? Maybe someone. Yeah. Sorry? High nervous? Hangover. Ah, if you have a hangover, that influences also your mood. Okay. Yes.
A bit fatigued as well.
A bit fatigue. Okay, and what's the interaction that's going on then?
A bit drowsiness, the same as focus,
Less focus, yeah. Okay, yeah, we will hear much more about it during the talk today. Well, for today's lecture, we have invited Laura Steenbergen. She's a clinical neuroscientist who works at the clinical psychology unit of the Leiden University. And in her talk, she will discuss different pathways of interaction of the gut-brain axis. And she will also discuss how the results of her research, but also of the research of colleagues in her field, provide a paradigm shift in how we think feelings, thoughts, and behavior are shaped. But maybe even more interesting and maybe even more important is that these insights also contribute to the prevention of mental illness. After the talk, there is a short time for questions, but for now, please give her a warm welcome and enjoy the lecture today. Laura Steenbergen.
Wow, thank you, and thank you all for being here. If you wonder, why did you put on such a shiny shirt? I don't wear this every day, but today is actually the first time that I'm appearing in front of a physical audience again. So I thought we should celebrate that. Yes, yeah, it's really nice, right? The downside of that is that you just told me you're more irritable and less focused because you're hungry, so I guess I have a hard job, but I'll try to help you with that. Yeah, today we'll be talking about the gut-brain axis, and I'm calling it the gut-brain axis because first thing to be learned for you today, the gut-brain axis is bidirectional, so it means there's communication from the gut to the brain, but of course also from your brain to your gut. I will show you today, however, that about 90% of the information is carried from your body to your brain. Let's start at the beginning. Some of you might recognize, not necessarily this picture or the beach, but the feeling. So I want you, despite not being able to focus so well, I want you to take a moment to think about when you felt down, or maybe someone you know is suffering from depression or burnout or an anxiety disorder. I'm not going to ask you if you do or if you know someone, but just take a moment to think about that. We do recognize sadness. Maybe some of us recognize depression, anxiety, which is when it's prolonged. And then at some point you start feeling like this. You might feel hopeless, give up. A lot of students ruminate a lot, piekeren in Dutch. You might worry about the future, etc., etc. Well, the good thing is we can do something about that, but the bad thing is, despite decades of research in neuroscience and clinical psychology, the treatments we have are not 100% effective. I don't know if You do know someone that perhaps is taking, for example, antidepressives. We know that in many people, those do not work. And even if they do work, you start taking them today, they will only have an effect in about 5-6 weeks from now. Of course, we want to reduce that suffering, and we should do something not only to treat those disorders better, but also to prevent them. And I'm saying that because I feel supported by the World Health Organization that states basically every year, but this statement is from 2019, that the burden of mental disorders continues to rise, and it has very severe consequences in lots of, let's say, lots of aspects of society. What the WHO also said, I didn't copy it here, is that we should do more to try to prevent these disorders. Because many mental disorders, and especially depression and anxiety, are what we call stress-related. And they are, to some extent, preventable. Now, the question is, if neuroscience and psychology have been studying this for decades, maybe centuries even, how is it possible that we haven't found a treatment yet? How is it possible that we're not able to completely prevent mental disorders? The answer is I don't know, but my answer is also perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. We are often convinced that depression, anxiety, stress are in our brains, in our minds, in Dutch tussen je oren. What if we're actually looking in the wrong place? And I'm not the first to come with that idea. That idea is very old, actually, because Hippocrates here, the father of what we call modern medicine, actually already said that all disease begins in the gut. What if he was also right with regard to mental disorders, mental diseases? What if perhaps mental disorders, diseases, also start in the gut? Could we then perhaps in the future use the gut to treat people or even prevent mental disorders? Maybe I'm going to convince you a little bit today, but on the other hand, there's also lots that we do not know yet. But let me share with you what we do know, because it's not such a crazy idea after all. A very common observation in medicine is that mental problems and what we call gastrointestinal complaints or problems are related. If you wonder why I put problems in between quotation modes or under quotation modes, this is because quotation marks, sorry. This is because mental problems are sometimes experienced as problems, or we define them as problems, but not everyone sees it as a problem. To give you an idea, for example, people who suffer or have ADHD can be very flexible regarding their minds, also very distractible. Society has kind of decided that that's a problem, but the individuals themselves not always experience this as a problem. So that's why I put it in between quotation marks, just because the subjective experience doesn't always match the clinical definition. But putting that aside, what we see in clinical science, clinical practice even, is that there's what we call comorbidity between mental problems and gastrointestinal complaints. To give you some examples, for example, autism is often related to not being able to go to the toilet frequently, to defecate, as we call it. We also see that depression and anxiety, maybe the early stages of that, are related to bloating or to feeling uncomfortable in your belly. We see that sometimes ADHD, for example, is related to diarrhea. And even though these are very severe, can be very severe problems, I think what Gijs also tried to point at is that many of us recognize the idea that the experiences of our bellies can be related to how we mentally feel. For example, I didn't hear it, but when you're in love, you feel butterflies in your stomach. Or when you're nervous, because perhaps you have to give a presentation for the first time in 3 years for 200 people, you might feel, a little bit of rumbling in your belly, not being able to go to the toilet or actually needing to go to the toilet way more often than usual. So this is how we ourselves actually also experience this relation between the belly and the brain, or the gut and the brain. Now, you're smart students, right? At least that's what I'm assuming. So I can hear you thinking almost, but how are they related? Or why would that be related? I mean, it makes sense that everything in your body is related, and I guess it makes sense that the brain knows things. But why would those things be related? To answer that question, we're going to go back to the start of the Earth, actually. So here you see what we call the Philogenetic tree of life. To the biologists here, it might look familiar. At the beginning or in the middle of the graph, the picture, you see the birth of Earth. That's always a very difficult thing to pronounce, but yes, I succeeded. And towards the side, so either left or right, you see the now. So this is millions of years ago, this is the now, today, and here's also today. And you see basically all organisms that evolved and live on Earth. What stands out to me is that when we're talking about neuroscience and clinical practice, medicine, we often pharmacology. We often base ourselves on research that's done in rodents and mice and rats. But actually, mice and rats are quite different, on a quite different place on this tree. Because I don't want to make you feel small, but this is where we are. This is where humans are. So we've been around relatively short, very, very short, actually, compared to, for example, these 3 organisms here. I'm not going to try to pronounce them because despite spending years in this research, I still am not able to correctly pronounce this. But basically grouped together, we call these 3 organisms here microbiota. And what I find interesting is that these microbiota are not only living besides us, like on your chair or on your kitchen table or even on your skin, but they're living inside us. We'll talk about more about that later. Do some of you know who Craig Venter is? Hands? No? Biologist? No? Craig Venter was the human whose genome was first sequenced. He paid for it and he let his whole genome be sequenced. And he actually said, if you don't like bacteria, you're on the wrong planet because this is the planet of bacteria. And again, not only are those bacteria that we see here, but also the other 2, living beside us, on our chairs, on our skins, but they're actually living inside us. And before I continue on that, I want to ask you a question. Maybe we should exempt the biologists in this room from this question, but I want to ask you, how human do you think we are? Who says, I'm 100% human? Raise your hand. Yeah. I hope you feel 100% human, but that's a different question. Okay, not everyone is convinced of 100%. Who says 75%? Yeah. Okay. Who says 50%? Yeah. I would agree with you that we are about 50% human, although the exact number might depend on when you last went to the toilet. So it's actually true that if you count your cells before you go to the toilet, you might be a little bit more microbe. And if you count after you go to the toilet, you might be a little bit more human. But that's a detail. So why am I saying that? Why would we say that we are only 50% human? Because the other 50 or perhaps even more percent were microbiota, were these organisms that I showed you in the previous graph. This is our body. And what you see here is a picture of all the organisms that are living inside us. Inside our lungs, our bellies, for the ladies, inside our vagina, but also on our skin and also in our mouth. So we have an oral microbiome, a skin microbiome, a vaginal microbiome, and the gut microbiome. Now, the reason I'm focusing on the gut microbiome is because about 90% of the microbes that live in our body can be found in our gut. What's important to know about the whole body, actually, I skipped this part, is that if we would count genetically, so cell-wise, we're about 50% microbe and 50% human. That's the consensus at this moment. But if we would look genetically, the genetic information that all the microbes are carrying, if we would compare that to the human genetic information we carry, we're actually 150 times more microbial than we are human. And even though I'm a psychologist, a clinical neuroscientist, I would say it's naive to assume that those organisms and that genetic information doesn't affect how we feel and behave, right? Okay, back to the gut microbiome. As I said, we have all these different microbiomes, but we often focus on the gut microbiome, or microbiota. And this is because, again, about 80 to 90% of the microbes that live in our body can be found in our guts. And practically speaking, it's very easy to get a sample of that. So if we want a sample of, for example, your lung microbiota, we would have to take a sample of your lungs, which is tricky, especially in healthy humans. But you produce a gut sample every day, at least most humans do. And yes, that means that on a daily basis, I'm asking individuals, volunteers, to send their poops to my lab. and then we extract genetic information, we see which microbiota are in there. But putting that detail aside, what we see in that poop is that there's about 500 to 5,000 different, what we call observed taxonomic units, or species of microorganisms. Before we continue, you might wonder, okay, sometimes you talk about the microbiota, and sometimes you talk about the microbiome. It's basically the same thing, with the difference that the microbiota means I'm talking about the living organisms. In the microbiome, I'm talking about the living organisms plus their genetic information. So for me as a scientist, it's practically the same thing, but it's basically another level of information added. But for today, you can kind of assume them as being similar definitions. But I wanted you to know the difference anyhow, because it's not exactly the same. So we have between 500 and 5,000 different species in our guts alone. You might think, why is that such a broad estimation, 500 and 5,000? There's 4,500 in between that. That's because the current technologies do not completely allow us to identify each organism in our gut. They look a bit alike, and we cannot zoom in to the extent that we can really see which are different and which are not. So these are estimations. It might turn out in the end that we have even 10,000 different organisms, but at this point, we don't know. What we do know is that each microbiota is personal, and if it would be possible, we would say it's even more personal or more unique than your fingerprint. Because again, not only do you have all these microbiota, but they also all carry that genetic material, 150 times more than we have human material. So that microbiota that we find and the microbiome we find in your gut is, well, what's the maximum of unique? That's what it is. And what we know about health, this is why I came here today, is that low diversity in gut microbiota is related to poorer health. How should you see that? It's not only important that you have a lot of organisms in your gut, but you have a lot of different organisms. So it's not about having one organism or another, but it's about as many different organisms as possible that contributes to a healthy life or to health of your body. Also, when it comes to your brain. Of course, science has known this for a couple of decades. And there's been a lot of scientific interest in the gut microbiome, or the microbiome in general, in relation to health, especially cardiovascular diseases, but lately also more diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, diabetes, you can name them. Not only has there been a lot of scientific interest, as you see here, but also has there been a lot of popular scientific interest. So, who of you has read one of these books, perhaps? Especially this one used to be, I don't know if it's still popular, but this used to be very popular. It's called De Mooie Voedselmachine in Dutch. No one has read that? Yeah, I see some hands, all right. Well, if you want to know more about what I'm talking about today and a little bit about the brain, they also mentioned you can read one of these books. But still, I hear you thinking almost, okay, wait a second, you promised us to talk about the gut-brain axis. We've talked about the gut and the microbiota in it, but how is the brain related? And not only how is the brain related, but how are our thoughts and feelings and our behavior and our mood related to that? Well, to explain you that, we're going to go back to the beginning of basically this research line, which isn't so old yet. In 2004, there was a research group in Asia that concluded or studied that germ-free mice have a stronger stress response than normal mice. For those of you who don't know, germ-free mice are mice that are born and kept sterile, so they are not exposed to any bacteria. They don't have a microbiota, they don't have a microbiome. And what the researchers did is they exposed them to stress. That's the little striped line you see here, basically putting the mice in a small tube, inducing claustrophobia, and then they would test how their stress hormones would respond to that. And what they saw was that the mice that were germ-free, not exposed to microbiota, showed a stronger stress response. That's the black dot here. The normal microbiota mice are the white ones here. So you see quite a difference. What was even more striking was that if they would give those germ-free mice that showed a stronger stress response probiotics, that responsivity was reduced or reversed. So the lines started to look exactly the same again as the normal microbiota mice. So apparently giving probiotics to germ-free mice reduced their stress responsivity. For those of you who don't know or who wonder, the official definition of probiotics is that they are live microorganisms that, when ingested, have a beneficial effect on the host. And some of you might know them in yogurt forms. You have, for example, in the Netherlands, we have Yakult or Vivit. I'm not being paid for that, by the way. There are some probiotic creams also. Probiotics are sometimes added to wine or beer. And we also have natural probiotics, like, for example, sauerkraut or zuurkool or pickles. Anything that's fermented can have probiotics, natural probiotics, but we can also ingest probiotics by means of a supplement, just if you wanted to be, or if you were interested. So again, in 2004, there was this group who saw that germ-free mice showed an enhanced stress response, and that if you would give those mice probiotics, that stress response was normalized to what normal mice also show. That, of course, sparked a major, let's say, interest into how the gut microbiota are related to stress and to anything that comes after stress. So anxiety, depression, well, basically anything. And it caused what we now call a paradigm shift in neuroscience. I might not sound so enthusiastic, and that's because all of this research, up until then, all of that research had been done in mice. I started this talk by telling you that the burden of mental disorders kept rising. That is a societal burden that, goes for humans. The fact that mice are perhaps experiencing depression, I don't think bothers us that much. But the fact that we are experiencing that, that's what causes the burden and what puts the, let's say, weight on society. So therefore, I think you, but especially I, wondered after all those studies, but what about us? What about humans? What does this mice research mean for humans? Is our gut microbiota related to our stress response and to mood and thoughts and behavior? The answer is yes, but I'll tell you why we came to that conclusion. In order to explain to you how we study these mechanisms in humans, I brought this nice piece of art, the thinker, because in humans, we are exposed to stress every day, right? I don't think there's anyone in this room who has never experienced stress. If you have never experienced stress, please let me know, because you'd be an interesting study object. But I don't think we're going to find anyone. So when we are experiencing stress, we can sometimes get into a bit of a sad mood. So you start overthinking your life. You start ruminating. You start worrying. You might feel a bit sad and think, I should have taken different decisions in life. I'm not such a nice friend. You might feel more irritable. I don't remember who said it, but you might feel more irritable, become a little bit more aggressive, actually. That's what we call cognitive reactivity. Cognitive reactivity to sad mood. So that means, how do you reply or how do you respond on a cognitive level, on a thought level, to your sad mood? Do you start ruminating and worrying? Do you become a bit more aggressive, etc.? That cognitive reactivity, so what your thoughts become like when you feel down, that predicts how vulnerable you are for a depression. Because people who, for example, ruminate more are more likely to develop a depression. That doesn't mean that if you ruminate, you're going to get a depression, but it's predictive. So what we did in a study is that we gave people a probiotic or a placebo for 4 weeks, and we measured before and after what their cognitive reactivity, so their thoughts, basically looked like when they were in a sad mood. And what we found was that after 4 weeks of taking probiotics, the probiotic group significantly decreased when it comes to cognitive reactivity. And specifically, they decreased regarding aggressive thoughts, so irritability that we heard before, and they decreased regarding rumination. So they started worrying a little bit less about life. That was important, a very important study, actually. I never expected that, but we were the first to show that in humans, doing something to the gut microbiota, administering probiotics, could change something on a cognitive level. And then, basically, a lot of studies followed, and I've tried to find all of them, but these are all the studies or the labs that have now replicated our effect, which, as you might know, is very important in science, so I feel confident sharing this. There's 2 studies that did not replicate this effect. I want to share that with you. The main reason they also conclude they did not replicate the effect of probiotics reducing this cognitive reactivity is because people showed very low cognitive reactivity at the beginning. So of course, if you want to improve something, it has to be bad to begin with. If you never experience stress, I cannot reduce your experience of stress. So that's basically why these studies didn't find an effect. After that, more studies, both in animals and in humans, started looking at, okay, how might that work? How is the gut, again, related to the brain? Biologically, systemically, neurologically, how does it work? And this is a summary of the different pathways that we found. So we see here, for example, the gut microbiota that have all kinds of effects on, for example, immune cells and the release of pro- and anti-inflammatory cytokines, for those of you who are familiar with that. We see an effect on amino acid metabolism. Tryptophan is very important because I don't know if you know this, but tryptophan is an amino acid that's the precursor of serotonin. And you might know serotonin as the happiness neurotransmitter. Not completely true, but serotonin is very important in your brain to be able to have positive moods, or specifically, if you have lower serotonin, you'll feel less happy. So tryptophan is important because it can enhance or at least stimulate serotonin release in your brain. You might wonder, what do probiotics do, right? Well, the idea is that probiotics support your gut barrier. So there are a lot of toxic processes happening in your gut, and you don't want to leak those into to leak into the bloodstream, because that can have all kinds of negative effects on all the pathways here. So the idea is also of the probiotics that we used, if you support this gut barrier here between your microbiota and your bloodstream, basically, then the systems all become a bit more healthy or efficient, and you can support healthy functioning also of your brain, and eventually therefore mood and cognition and emotion. So that's one part, the probiotics. What I find interesting in this whole focus of microbiota and gut-brain axis is that there's one key player, one central, let's say, axis, which is called the vagus nerve, that not many people look at. I find the vagus nerve interesting because it has already been proposed 2 decades ago, that the vagus nerve is a driving phylogenetic force, let's say, in our ability to regulate what we call complex behaviors. Social interactions, emotion regulation, emotion recognition, attention, your ability to focus might very well depend on activity of your vagus nerve. And since your vagus nerve is activated and regulated by your microbiota, this makes the gut microbiota important again. I have about a few minutes left, so I want to show you what we're doing with that vagus nerve. How do we study the role of the vagus nerve in emotion and emotion regulation? The difficulty is that in humans, we cannot measure activity of the vagus nerve, at least not from the gut to the brain. We cannot really measure how active is your vagus nerve, and therefore how well do you do, or might that be related to how you feel. But what we can do is stimulate it. We use a tool or a device for this, which looks a little bit like an old iPod or something. And we can put an electrode in the left ear where afferent fibers of your vagus nerve are located. So if you put this electrode in your left ear and we turn the device on, we stimulate the vagus nerve directly. So this allows us to conclude almost, or to, draw almost causal conclusions, because we directly stimulate the vagus nerve. And we've done that in a couple of studies, not only I, but also colleagues, and we've seen a couple of things related to emotion. For example, stimulating the vagus nerve enhances or strengthens the influence of eye contact. So it allows people a little bit better to make eye contact, and specifically the influence of someone's gaze becomes stronger. So to give you an idea, when you and I are looking at each other and you're looking in my eyes, if I look that way, you're going to follow my gaze, because you will assume that something relevant is happening there. And what we see is when you stimulate the vagus nerve, you tend to follow my gaze even more or even stronger. So that's one thing. Eye contact is affected by vagal nerve activation. The other thing we see is that when we stimulate the vagus nerve, people's ability to recognize emotions, and specifically negative emotions, becomes different. This is important because people who suffer from depression or experience a lot of stress usually become less able to recognize emotions. They flatten a little bit. They become less able to make social contact, etc. And again, vagal nerve stimulation mostly enhances people's ability to recognize these negative emotions, which is important because imagine that you are no longer able to recognize that your friend is sad or angry. That's going to affect your life as well, because you'll feel kind of detangled, is that the word? Distance from your friends and the world. It's important to recognize people's emotions. And the last example I brought for you today is when we stimulate the vagus nerve and we expose people to a scary image of, for example, a snake. We ask them how intense their emotion or their anxiety or their fear is. And we next ask them, what do you think about the snake? What we see is that the intensity of their emotions decreases. So in summary, vagal nerve stimulation enhances the effect of gaze or eye contact. It enhances your ability to recognize negative emotions, and it decreases emotional intensity. Now think about the effect that that might have on your daily life. Often with scientific studies, we're kind of like, what's the effect for daily life? But putting these three together, I think we can conclude that the vagus nerve is very important in our daily functioning, recognizing where people are attending to, how people's emotions are, and how we respond to that. Put together, this vagus nerve, gut-brain axis, is important in how we feel and think. And I brought to you a quote which is distantly related, namely that most of us think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel. We often think that we think before we feel, but actually we feel before we think. And this is where the vagus nerve comes in again, because it carries all the information from not only the gut, but also the rest of your body to your brain. And it tells your brain how you're feeling, next allows you to think things. Bringing us back to this picture, depicting all the pathways from the gut to the brain, of which I too shortly explained to you or mentioned to you, meaning that if this information carrying here, information processing here somewhere goes wrong, for example, because you have low diversity in your gut, or because this gut barrier is disrupted, or because somehow the vagus nerve isn't efficiently active or healthily active, you might start feeling sad. You might start feeling distance from the people around you. You might experience stress, respond more heavily to that stress, and even experience depression or anxiety at some point. We're not completely there yet. We still need to do a lot of research also to examine, for example, what's the clinical practice, right? If someone is suffering from anxiety or depression, can we stimulate the vagus nerve, or can we give them certain probiotics to make them better? For some people, the answer might be yes. For some people, the answer might be it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we're working on it. I want to end by saying that, after all, this guy that lived thousands of years ago might not have been that wrong when he said that all disease begins in the gut. And I think it's important for us, let's say, the new generation of scientists, to consider that even diseases or disorders of which we often think they're between your ears or in your brain might actually have not necessarily a cause, but a key aspect happening in your gut. With that, I'm going to end my talk today. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for sharing all your insights with us. And yeah, time is short, but we still have some 5 minutes for questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and our student assistant with a catch box is coming your way. So, who would like? Yeah, I see a hand going up in the middle there. So, the catch box is also coming. Yeah, nice. Good catch.
Are the microbiota in your belly affected by alcohol consumption?
The influence of alcohol consumption. In the student setting, a good question.
Very important question. Absolutely, yes. Basically, anything you ingest has to be metabolized by your gut microbiota. And mostly what alcohol does, alcohol is a form of sugar, right? What alcohol does is feed the bad bacteria. It can reduce microbial diversity, but it can also basically enhance the bad bacteria, so the opposite of probiotics, to, well, how do you say, replicate in your gut. So yes, the short answer is yes, it's influencing your gut microbiota.
All right.
Okay, thank you for your question. I see also a hand here, so you can throw the mic.
Okay.
And maybe...
Wow.
That's a good one, yeah.
Hi. So would you recommend for people who have a ruminating or anxiety disorder, would you recommend for them to take probiotics for several weeks and see if it works?
Yeah? Yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, the thing with science, and that's what I always find difficult, and I think you guys should know this if you are not already aware of this, is that we're doing even what we call randomized controlled trials. That's kind of the highest level of clinical science that we can do. We give a group of people, or the same group of people, placebo or a probiotic or a medicine, we see if it works, we compare it. That's the strongest thing we can do in science. But of course, the thing remains, even if you would be ruminating a lot, and even if you have participated in my study, it doesn't mean that you as an individual will see this effect, because we're drawing conclusions based on averages. So I would say, try it. Keep an eye on yourself, see if it works. If it doesn't work, you can stop again. That's the nice thing about probiotics. They can have negative effects, but usually not. If you're taking other medications, you should discuss that with your GP, for example. But if you don't take any other medications, you can safely try them. Yeah.
And if you look at the different pathways, which pathway can we influence most?
With probiotics?
Yeah, or with other...
Well, generally the idea would be, I don't know if I can quickly scroll back, but the idea would be that any pathway is basically simultaneously affected. So if we stimulate only the vagus nerve, then at that moment we're only affecting the vagus nerve. But as I told you, the carrying of information also goes down. So we stimulate the vagus nerve, but everything changes in response to that. So if you start doing some manipulation of your gut microbiota, which is at the complete bottom, then all pathways can be affected. Exactly which pathways we don't know, might also differ between individuals. But there is not necessarily one pathway that's more important or stronger than the other. They're all equally important. Yeah.
Okay. Another question here in the middle. Yeah.
Wow.
Very nice.
Okay. My question is about when you were talking about your
Could you
study.
keep the mic a bit closer?
Sorry. Yeah. When you were talking about your study, you were showing us some graphs, and in the graph there were two different kinds of probiotics. Like they were labeled aggression probiotic and rumination probiotic. Were there different probiotics used for different responses, or did I just misunderstand?
This is where my lack of PowerPoint skills is showing.
Okay.
So actually, it's the same probiotics. It's subscales of a questionnaire. So we had placebo or probiotic, but for some reason it shows the aggression subscale for it. But it's exactly the same group. It's the same probiotic, just two different subscores, let's say. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And for those of you who are interested, you might ask, which probiotics do we need to take? I don't know, that might differ per individual, but the idea is, as I told you, that a lot of diversity in your gut is important. So when you take probiotics, it's important to take a probiotic that contains a lot of different organisms, a lot of different bacteria. That's also what we did in this study, because the idea is then that each bacteria can affect a slightly different path along the pathway, and thereby have the most beneficial effects, let's say. Just as a side note.
Okay, last short question. I saw... Yeah.
Yeah, because you talked a little bit about the probiotics in the Yakult bottles, but actually those are just one bacteria. What do you think of the effect of this one bacteria on your
so it's
probiotic system?
I know that Yakult as a company is actually doing a lot of scientific research, and they find very specific effects. I think, for example, the probiotic that's contained in Yakult is a lactobacillus strain, if I'm correct, and that can specifically affect anxiety-related complaints, but very specifically. I would say, it doesn't necessarily do any harm, although, let's be honest, they're quite expensive, those drinks. I personally, prefer to take a probiotic that contains multiple different bacteria from the point of view that diversity is important. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. Unfortunately, the time is up, so we have to end up the session. But I saw some more hands. I'll
be here.
Yeah. Laura is still here, and you can just come down and ask your question in person. Thank you for being here. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to make a live stream today, but we recorded the lecture. So if you would like to look back to the lecture from next week, we will put it online on our website. Please wait a moment before you leave. Thank you. Also, for the people who were not able to register for use, you can just come down and here and just make a nice line, and then we will do the registration. Yeah, there are some more programs coming up, but for now, please again give a warm applause for Laura Steenbergen. Thank you very much and see you next time. Bye-bye.